Alright, let's talk about Replace, shall we? Because this is one of those games that looks incredible, but doesn't quite come together. Now at its heart, this is a gorgeous pixel art cyberpunk adventure. It tells a timely story about artificial intelligence and what it means to be human. It's simple and effective, filled with small, reflective moments that either make you think or just sit back and admire this gorgeously rendered world. Because visually, this game is stunning. But unfortunately, where Replaced really struggles is in how it plays. Set in an alternate 1980s America after a nuclear catastrophe, the game sees you take on the role of Reach, an artificial intelligence trapped inside the body of its creator, Warren Marsh. It's a pretty good hook, especially because as you play as Reach, you struggle to understand basic human functions, which feeds nicely into early tutorials, before you're dropped into Phoenix City and its surrounding area, where you explore this corrupt dystopian world controlled by the Phoenix Corporation. The early hours take place out on the fringes, where you meet some of the more bizarre inhabitants, known as termites, before the focus shifts towards the city itself and the PCPD, which is a corrupt police force operating within it. Your goal here is to uncover the truth behind your creation and whether it can be undone. And to be fair, the story does do enough to keep you moving forward. I won't spoil anything major, don't worry, but there's a steady sense of intrigue throughout, even if some of the plot points are a little cliched. A side quests pop up along the way, but most of them here are fairly routine. A lot of the time you're just running errands or grabbing items, and there's nothing especially memorable, but the game does slip up a few times by really leaning into those mundane fetch quests. There is an arcade side activity that adds a bit of variety, but again it feels more like filler than something meaningful. Where the game does stand out though is in its world building. You see, Replaced includes a scanning system which is genuinely great. There are over 100 items to scan, things like burgers, ID cards and old toys are simple small details to help sell the world. But more importantly, you've also got things like archived newspapers and detailed news reports that dig into the backstory of the nuclear catastrophe and the social and political implications on the world. And then you've got news counters scattered around the world that actually update based on your actions. It's a small detail, but it makes Phoenix City feel reactive, like it's actually evolving alongside your actions. The problem is, once you move past the atmosphere and vibes, the gameplay doesn't quite hold up. Combat is where this is the most obvious. You're repeatedly fighting the same enemy types, which range from shielded grunts, ranged attackers, and heavier robotic enemies, and the encounters rarely evolve beyond that. It doesn't help that your moveset is limited to say the least. You got your basic melee attacks, a pickaxe to break shields, the ability to deflect projectiles, and eventually a shockwave to push enemies back. But that's pretty much it. Even by the time you reach the final boss, which honestly is pretty underwhelming, combat hasn't really developed at all. And that's a real issue. Across an 8 to 10 hour game that features a lot of combat, you're doing the same thing over and over again without enough variation to keep it engaging. It really starts to feel like something you're just pushing through, and I found myself groaning every time a new combat arena arrived late on in the game. Platforming is another weak point, and this is where frustration really starts to creep in. Controls aren't completely broken, don't worry, but they can feel very unresponsive, especially when using the pickaxe mid-platforming. And that becomes a real issue in more demanding sections. There's a late game moment where you're outrunning electricity, and another where you need to swing across 3 high ledges in quick succession. These should feel tense and rewarding, but instead they're often turned into trial and error sequences because the inputs just don't feel consistent. And then there's the visual design. And don't get me wrong, the environments are beautiful, but sometimes they're a bit too detailed. You'll see cracks in walls that look like you should be able to latch onto with your pickaxe, but only some of them actually work. And when you combine that with the fact that the controls aren't always responsive, you might actually find yourself trying to jump onto these several times before realizing that's not where you're supposed to go. The same thing happens with ledges too. Some of them can be grabbed, others are just out of reach, and it's difficult to discern whether it's the game itself stopping you from reaching that area, or whether you're not quite there with the platforming. There are moments where the game uses visual cues like splashes of paint to guide you, but it doesn't stick to that consistently, which only exacerbates the problem. So instead of learning a clear system, you're often just kind of guessing what's interactable. Breaking things up here, there are a few stealth sections throughout the game, but they're pretty basic and mostly just see you staying out of sight from turrets that move from side to side. There is a late game hacking ability here that adds a slight twist, but it never really evolves into anything substantial. That said, the game does show flashes of creativity. Chapter 8 is a great example here. It introduces crowd-based stealth mechanics and gives you a more dynamic environment to work with. And to be honest, it's genuinely one of the best parts of the game, which just raises a question, why wasn't more of this used earlier? To its credit, Replace does a great job with its presentation. There are plenty of cinematic moments where the camera pulls back and lets you run through these detailed environments, or where dialogue plays out while you move through vents or across long metal walkways. It all looks fantastic, but the game also leans on certain tricks a bit too often. There's one in particular where you suddenly collapse through the floor after creeping across the vents and drop straight into a combat arena. It works the first few times to catch you off guard, but after a while you start to see it coming. And this ties neatly into the pacing of the game too. There's a noticeable stop-start rhythm throughout, where you'll have bursts of action, followed by slower sections, dialogue-heavy moments, or chapters set in the safe zone that acts as a breather. Individually, these moments are fine. I mean, they do help to build the world and give characters more space, but they happen quite frequently. And when you combine that with the slow movement, repetitive combat, and uneven platforming, yeah, certain chapters certainly start to drag more than they should. And one area that really stands out though is the soundtrack. Some of the collectible tracks in particular, especially Dusk and Void, are genuinely excellent. There's a mix of synth-heavy tracks and more melodic vocal pieces, and they complement each other really well. It actually gave me a bit of a Death Stranding vibe in places. It might not be the standout soundtrack of the year, especially compared to something like Memories in Orbit, but there's still a lot here to appreciate. Overall then, Replaced is a stylish but flawed cyberpunk indie. There's a strong idea at its core, and visually it's certainly very impressive, but the gameplay doesn't evolve enough to match it. Combat quickly becomes repetitive, platforming is inconsistent at best, and the pacing struggles to maintain momentum. If you can push through those issues, the story and world are just about strong enough to carry you through to the end. It's definitely an experience. I mean, it's one that's easy to admire in moments, even if it never quite comes together when the credits roll. Thanks for watching, and do let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Smash a like or subscribe to the channel, your support is very much appreciated. I'm Greg Wheeler, and from all of us over here at The Review Geek, we'll see you on the next video.